The Conclave Crew has a sketch of the next Pope coming up. Welcome to this Arroyo Grande series, the Conclave Crew Vatican Edition, Episode 4. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Taylor Fragon Capital Management, Faith, Family, and Finances. Visit them at taylorfragon.com. Let's convene the crew. Father Gerald Murray, canon lawyer of the Archdiocese of New York, Robert Royal, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, and I'm Raymond Arroyo. Later in the show, we'll be joined by Vatican expert Ed Pentin. Go subscribe to the Arroyo Grande podcast now on iHeart, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube at Arroyo Grande Show. And like this episode, be kind, like it. The Cardinals met in the Pauline Chapel earlier today for a group prayer. Then all 133 of them processed into the Sistine Chapel, which will be the site of the conclave. They swore an oath, and then Archbishop Diego Ravelli yelled in Latin, "Everyone out," sealing them away, as this College of Cardinals has been sealed away to elect a pope since 1274. I want to talk about the shape of who that pope might be. But first, the historic precedent. People forget this is the election of St. Peter's successor, the apostle, the first apostle, his stand-in, if you will. Cardinal Ray admonished these men this morning as they all met for Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. He urged them to turn their attention to Jesus the judge, to inspire them to select the right man to give the keys of heaven. What does that mean, Father Murray? And why does Peter remain relevant and the Pope all these years later, 2,000 years after the first Pope, St. Peter?
Yeah, the keys symbolism actually goes back to the Old Testament. So the keeper of the keys was sort of the vice king in a sense. You know, the king gave his power to the key holder to let in and out of the palace. And Jesus gave the power of the keys to St. Peter. He is the chief of the apostles. He's the rock upon which Christ built the church. So he has the power of Christ to bind and to loose. So that basically symbolizes that the church carries out through St. Peter a divine function of opening the doors of heaven through the administration of the sacraments and the preaching of the gospel. So it's a very symbolic thing. That's why the keys are actually one of the main symbols you'll see engraved all around Rome in the buildings and different places where the Holy Father's activities are carried out.
Yeah, Bob, do you want to emphasize anything there? That this is really an apostolic election. It's not a political fight. It's not a political and regional war about, who should be in charge of the Catholic Church. It is a spiritual charge that goes deep, deep into the history and certainly to the roots of history of Christianity.
Yeah, and it isn't even in a way, although you have to take into account the personality of the person who is about to be elected. I mean, obviously, popes, like every human being, have personality traits. But this is not a matter of persons. This is not a respecter of persons. This is an office that has to be engaged with personally. We talked about yesterday that the Pope, the person does not become Pope merely by receiving the proper number of votes, but must also accept it and take on that responsibility. And I think some of the commentary I've seen this past week really tries to emphasize that. There were obviously Jorge Bergoglio was a very personable man, but he relatively neglected the office of Peter. And I think that the popes, the cardinals who are electing the next pope may be thinking precisely about why it is that the Petrine office ought to maybe be given a little bit more emphasis than it has recently.
Bob and Father, you saw this new CBS poll, like anybody cares, but I have to run it down because it's getting such coverage. 42% of those polls said they claim to be Catholics. The next pope should continue the teachings of Pope Francis. 37% want more conservative teachings. 21% want more progressive teachings. Bob, my first question, who are these alleged Catholics?
Well, as we know, we've been around the block on this many times. One of the problems with doing polls like this is, do they talk to Catholics who go to Mass?
Right.
Who go to confession, who take seriously what the church teaches. Once you dig into that, you get a very much different picture of what Catholics want and what they don't want. I would tend to think that the people who are in favor of a change or in favor of a greater emphasis on what Francis did, pay more attention to what goes on in Rome. But my sense is that by and large, most Catholics don't. They get a favorable or unfavorable view of who the Pope is, and they mostly would respond to a poll like that. I'm encouraged that 37% saying that they would like to have a bit of a change.
Father, this poll alleges, and again, it alleges that Catholics want the Church to change its position on birth control. 79% want that. 57% want married priests. 56% want female priests. My answer would be, look, there are many communions where these things are already offered, but explain why the Church isn't governed by polls.
Yeah, the Church is based on the words of Jesus Christ. Jesus, before he ascended into heaven, commissioned the 12 apostles to propagate the religion of Christianity, Christ's teaching. And he established it as a hierarchical church, meaning that it had appointed leaders who are shepherds. So we have bishops, priests, and deacons. And then from the bishops, the Bishop of Rome is the vicar of Christ. He's the universal shepherd. So the Pope rules over the church in union with and working with the bishops, priests, and deacons. But right there you have it. The church, the apostles didn't get together one day and said, Jesus is gone, what are we going to do? Let's form an organization to propagate his memory. If they founded that, then they could change the bylaws anytime they had a majority at the board meeting. No, I mean, right. This is a religion that was given by God to the people, and specifically to the baptized, the people who followed Christ. As a result, the job of any teacher is to accurately convey the message that they have received. And that's really why the pontificate of Pope Francis was so controversial, because he said and did things that none of his predecessors had ever done. And then when questioned about it, he never really offered a robust justification. He simply said, we're not changing anything. We're just basically putting a new way of being a Christian in place. And that a lot of people find, including me, very inadequate and needing to be revised.
I mean, Bob, there are a lot of Catholics who have that understanding that, well, if we just get enough of us, well, this is what the whole synodal way is about. I mean, the synod is really, let's pack the invitees that we like, who agree with us ideologically, and then we can change the bylaws, we can shift the doctrine. And you were right, that CBS does concede, if you go down to the bottom of the article in this poll they did, they concede that a smaller group of those Catholics who attend Mass a few times a month think the Church is in touch with the needs of the people. The non-Church attendees believe it's out of touch. So I'll give you a last word on this, Bob.
Yeah, you know, in America in particular, a lot of people are Catholic in name and Protestant in belief, because we believe that Christ did us a great favor, a great grace, a great mercy in leaving us an institution that helps us to understand what he taught and has a continuity going back to his closest collaborators, his closest colleagues among the apostles. You know, by contrast, Protestants kind of think it's sola scriptura, sola fide, that they make it up on their own. Well, if you think about this for a second, this really means that there is no firm teaching, that there is no authority that tells you what to do. I mean, I read a book once, and when I just looked into the 15th century, 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation started, within just a few decades, there were 250 or more different theories of what the Eucharist was. So, look, it's a great thing to have a church that we can rely on. There can still be debates in the church about how exactly we receive things at this moment in history. But the basics of the faith have been laid out. And if we don't have a church, then probably we don't really have Christianity.
Okay, let's talk about the next Pope. Qualities you believe he must have, informed by what you're hearing as well as what we've seen over the last couple of decades, really 30 years covering a series of pontificates. Draw a sketch for us. First up, doctrine. There seems to be a lot of doctrinal confusion out there in the wake of the Francis pontificate. Cardinal after cardinal has mentioned, and I'll quote from my notes, chaos, rampant confusion, doctrinal incoherency. Father, why are they saying that? And what must the next Pope do?
They're saying that because Pope Francis regrettably said things that contradicted previous church teaching. For instance, he said divorced and remarried people who do not have an annulment are entitled to receive communion in particular cases, but who decides which are the particular cases? So that was never taught. Adultery is a mortal sin, and those who are in an adulterous relationship are objectively in a serious sin, so they should not be allowed to receive communion. That's what it was taught by John Paul II and Benedict. Pope Francis regrettably said that homosexual couples, and I know exactly what was in the document, homosexual couples can be blessed by the priest. Well, we never said that. Anybody can be blessed, and we don't ask people before we bless them whether, what their particular state in life is. But when two people come together and say we're in a romantic and sexual relationship and we're in the same sex and we want to be blessed, the Church says, no, that's not blessable because that kind of relationship is immoral. Similarly, the Pope said that the death penalty is a violation of human rights. It's an unjust act of vengeance. The Church has never taught that. It's taught that it's moral in cases of grave crime. And then lastly, the Pope said that all religions are paths to God. He said that when he was in Indonesia. And that the Church has never taught. We say that men are searching on different paths to arrive at God, but that God has given us only one path, his Son, Jesus Christ, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Those are just 4 examples of things that he said, which are very unsettling because the Church has never said those things. So I think the next Pope, for me, prime quality required, doctrinal orthodoxy, and an ability to explain and defend and promote the teaching of the Church.
Bob, do you want to amplify anything there, add anything there?
Yeah, just one point. I've been reading lately about the nature of what's called managerialism. It's a theory of how you manage an organization. And people who practice this, by and large, emphasize process over results. And so what we've seen with the Synodal Church is, on the one hand, yes, it is kind of affirmed and it's left that, LGBT is more morally outside of Christianity, but we need to also be close and maybe be discussing but that's this kind of managerial where you don't actually have to tell some people yes and other people no. And a church that operates like that, even if it doesn't explicitly contradict the Gospels, or if it doesn't explicitly say that when Jesus says, no man comes to the Father except through me, it gives the impression, because the conversation keeps going on and on and on, and the process itself begins to tell you, well, maybe someday. And I think that even if I wouldn't defend every word that Francis put down in some of these controversial places by any means. But even if a person wanted to defend that, he would have to admit that there is this additional sense of constantly being on the brink of changing something, and that was deliberately cultivated, I believe.
Father, speak, if you will, to what we're hearing. We heard this repeatedly throughout the last week or so. It seems the cardinals are very interested in restoring canon law, the norms that were once in place. Now, this is one of the reasons people are looking to Cardinals Erdo and Mamberti, both esteemed canonists who could certainly speak to this concern. They think they could restore the canonical norms. Where are we now, and what should the next pope do? Why are they so alarmed about this?
Yeah, canon law is a set of rules that the Catholic Church operates under. Canon law has origins going way back to the beginning of the Church. So the Catholic Church views itself as an institution with sovereignty. In other words, it rules with God's authority over the people. And part of being a sovereign is you establish a set of laws, and then you enforce those laws, because laws promote social justice, they protect protection of the rights of people, good order, all the things necessary for people to flourish. Now, Pope Francis ignored canon law in many instances. I could go into specifics, but it would be too boring. But it was notorious for ignoring the law or giving dispensations or enacting things apart from the law. Just one example was he threw out some members of a religious congregation without due process. They got a letter saying, you're no longer a member. They never had in canon law, you can throw people out of religious order for just cause, but they have a right to defense. So you have to issue a process. We're going to investigate. We're going to hear the evidence. We're going to present the evidence to the accused. The accused has a right to respond, and the judge makes a judgment. In this case, the Pope sent an investigator and just issued a decree. So what we need in the Catholic Church is, let's have social order through the faithful observance of the rules that are set down in advance in canon law.
Bob, I want to move on. A liberal website published something called The Sins of Pope Francis. And among them were, I'm going to run through these, an authoritarian exercise of power, a devaluation of the church heritage. How can the next pope restore that, Bob? And what might that man bring to the table to restore those particular concerns?
Boy, that's an interesting list from
I'm just skimming.
Well, look, for me, I think one of the most important things symbolically he could do would be to bring back the traditional Latin Mass, because in one fell swoop, that kind of says, look, we are still back in continuity with the church. You know, as our friend Richard John Newhouse used to say, boy, there's a lot of church history before Vatican II. And so if you're going to base the contemporary Catholic Church solely on what's happened the last 50, 60 years, you're really cutting yourself off from a very great richness. And Vatican II talked about two things. People forget this. It talked about aggiornamento, which is an Italian word that means an updating. But it also talked about ressourcement, which means going back to the early church fathers and really digging into the ways that they thought, the way that they spoke. Why is it that they gave us this tradition that we have? And so you can do both things at once. You can engage the modern world, but also be looking more deeply back into your own tradition. For me, that is what the play of faith and reason always does in the modern world. And we were lacking that. I think that there was an emphasis on reaching out that was good, but there was an overemphasis on that. And what we need to do is to restore a balance where we say, yes, we're willing to talk with you, we're willing to welcome you, but this is who we are. And understand in the conversation that when you talk with the Catholic Church, we don't just make it up from day to day. We don't just tell you what you want to hear. We're here for the long run. We've been here for a long time, and we intend to be here for a long time into the future.
Father, what do you expect this next pope to do vis-a-vis the liturgy? I mean, Bob talked about the suppression of the old rite, the old Roman rite, the Tridentine Latin Mass. And really, but there was a diminishment of the grandeur of Catholic liturgy and all expressions of the Pope, really. What do you think the cardinals are looking for in the next man, and who might fit that bill?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, Pope Francis had a minimalistic view of how you celebrate the liturgy. He certainly celebrated the Mass validly and all, but, he used Vatican's glorious vestments. He kind of didn't use those. There were a lot of rituals he kind of dropped and things. He did not allow, as Bob said, the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, to be celebrated elsewhere. He made a whole set of unnecessary enemies, you could say, because people who like the Latin Mass are generally very pro-papal. But here they were thrown out of literally thrown out of churches. I've never heard of a pastoral provision in which throwing faithful Catholics out of their parishes was viewed as something charitable or necessary. So I think that has to be resolved. But it's kind of an area in the life of the church. Ever since the Reform after the Second Vatican Council, there's been great upsetness and things that are unsettled. John Paul II and Benedict tried to remedy it, but I think this is a work that's going to go on for another 50 to 100 years of trying to arrive at a modernized yet reverential liturgy, which may be in the vernacular, but is very, very much like the traditional Latin Mass and how it's celebrated.
Bob, I want to talk for a moment about the Wall Street Journal reports that since Pope Francis took over 12 years ago, the budget deficit for the Vatican tripled. The pension fund, you mentioned this in one of our earlier episodes, it has a $2 billion liability that it cannot fund, and $400 million was lost in that ridiculous real estate deal in Britain. How important will financial considerations, a sense of being a good steward of monies given and protecting that money, will this next pope have to be?
Well, it would beggar belief, at least for me, to think that the cardinals, who by and large are at least responsible men, would select someone who would be unable to deal with that. Or if they wanted someone who's a sort of a spiritual figurehead, we talked about Cardinal Sarra is not particularly an administrator, but they would have to have some guarantees that this issue would be addressed. I mean, in a sense, the abuse crisis is a moral crisis inside the church that absolutely must be addressed. And this financial question is a material crisis in the church that has to be addressed. And we know that there have been reductions in Peter's pence, that Peter's pence is being used for expenses, that there have been assets of the Vatican that have been sold off, I think mostly at this point, real estate assets. Yeah. But it's not hard to imagine in the very near future that they're going to have to start dipping into some of the artwork or the books in the Vatican library. This is not a good situation. It doesn't show a Catholic people that are supporting the Vatican the way we would expect them to, and they did in the past. So it's not just a matter of identifying this, but it's also a matter of identifying a person who we thought we were getting with Jorge Bergoglio, but we didn't, who can rectify the financial situation.
Well, Father, that's the question. And look, it's a big concern as I look at this. We remember 12 years ago, Jorge Bergoglio was elected because they imagined, our friend George Cardinal Pell imagined that Pope Francis would be the great reformer of not only finances, but the Vatican bureaucracy. Neither of those things really panned out. So talk about the financial part and connect it to what Bob was talking about, the sex abuse crisis. How did Pope Francis handle that? And what must the next Pope do to restore order and confidence in the Church?
Well, they're definitely going to need responsible administration of what we call the goods of the Church, meaning its assets, its donations, its buildings. And when we're talking about the Holy See and the Vatican, they have a lot of assets in a lot of places, but they're notoriously not well managed, particularly real estate. They'll have to look at that. And they're going to have to figure out how to finance this deficit of pensions. You know, a pension is not a gift. A pension is owed to people who worked for you, and the employer deferred compensation in the form of a pension rather than giving them all the money at the moment. So that has to be done. That's a matter of justice. Now, sex abuse, the Pope made some inroads with some documents and some processes. He established a process to prosecute bishops and other religious superiors who protected predator priests, but the application was spotty, and in some cases, there was no application. And this is a real problem. His first bishop he named after he became Pope is a man named Zanchetta. He was a friend of his, a priest from Argentina, and Zanchetta, as a diocesan bishop, was convicted of abusing seminarians in his diocese. The Pope, sad to say, when informed of the charges, believes Zanchetta's lie that his phone had been hacked, gave Zanchetta a job in the Vatican, and then, after he was convicted, he never prosecuted him with the canon law process. It took forever, and then we were told this past year, well, the process is ongoing, but when the Pope died, they hadn't yet to have a trial, even though it's, been going on for 3 or 4 years. So the Zanchetta case, there's a Rupnik case, I won't go into that. Sex abuse has to be treated for what it is. It is a crime. It doesn't matter who you know or what position you occupy in the church. You commit a crime and you're a minister of the gospel, you need to be punished and removed. I hope that's
there was zero tolerance unless you knew the Pope, and that's a problem. So hopefully there'll be one standard for everybody, and zero tolerance is not a bad one, but with due process. I mean, not all these cases these men are not always guilty, but you have to explore them. There has to be a canonical process, and that was, hopefully the next Pope will embrace that and understand that. The final message of the College of Cardinals, gents, as they came out of their general congregations, the last meeting, this got very little attention, and it could have outsized influence on how they choose this next Pope. They lamented the lack of progress promoting peace in the Ukraine, the Middle East, and other areas of the world. And then they issued, quote, a heartfelt appeal to all parties involved to reach as soon as possible a permanent ceasefire and to negotiate without preconditions and further delays the peace so deeply desired by the affected populations in the entire world. Bob, what influence will that statement have? Very important that it came at the end of the congregation meetings. They didn't often issue statements like this. What influence will that have? And who fits the bill to facilitate that kind of peace and at least initiate it? The Pope can't bring peace, but he can initiate it and certainly advocate for it.
Well, for me, Pizzaballa, the Archbishop and Cardinal Archbishop from Jerusalem, who has done so well in managing that very difficult circumstance in the Middle East, in Gaza and also in Israel, he stands out immediately, it seems to me, as the candidate that might be able to do that.
Tell me what you think the next Pope will look like. I don't need a name. I'm really not interested in a man, but sketch him for me.
Well, I think the next pope has to be a visible man of prayer and meditation, that he is scripturally rich in speaking about the gospel to people. I think he has to be a man who is confident in his role, that he is, in fact, the successor of Peter and the first representative of God on earth, and that he cooperates with brother bishops, but he does so in the role of Peter, which is to lead and to guide them and confirm them in the faith. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, I think the next pope has to be someone who is a realist, meaning he understands clearly that the financial, criminal, and other scandals surrounding the Holy See are not simply subjects of lamentation. They have to be things that need to be dealt with in the way a civil government deals with the problems of crime and associated economic chaos. So in other words, you have to be hard-headed. So you have to do what's required to put the house in order and to prosecute criminal priests and to make sure that it's quite clear to people in the Catholic Church who you know is irrelevant. What counts is whether you're faithful to the gospel and your duties. That's what counts.
Well, look, I agree with all of that. I also think we need a pope who will be manly, stand in the middle of the world with this countercultural message of Jesus Christ and confront that world with the eternal answers that matter and that still have relevance. I think it really is important. And, you know, John Paul, even Francis, they both went out to the world and declared the message. It has to be a clear, unwavering message. And I think if that Pope emerges from this conclave, millions of people will be drawn to this faith, especially young people. We're beginning to see the shoots of that springtime that John Paul talked about, but boy, are there a lot of landmines that this next Pope will have to dodge and diffuse before we get there. Gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment, but we're going to do something very special tomorrow. We're going to answer your questions, all of you watching this Conclave Crew series. Drop them in the comments below, or you can send them to Raymond@RaymondArroyo.com, Raymond@RaymondArroyo.com, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. I know there are a lot of them, and I've been seeing them all week, so we'll get to those. Thank you, Conclave Crew. Ed Pentin, Vatican journalist, is next with the major candidates who could be popes. Stay there. Are you looking for financial management that reflects your deepest values? Taylor Fergan Capital Management actively manages portfolios designed for those who prioritize faith, family, and long-term stewardship throughout their mutual fund, separately managed accounts, or family office accounts. Taylor Fergan Capital, values-driven investing to support your faith, family, and finances. There at taylorfergan.com. As a special edition, I wanted to bring in, and I so regard his work as just the best in the business. We're joined by senior correspondent of the National Catholic Register, the best reporter in Rome, and author of the College of Cardinals report, Ed Pentin. Ed, thanks for being here. I've heard from a number of cardinals how hopelessly undecided they seem to be going into this conclave. Is that what you're hearing?
Yes, I mean, I think they have been they don't really know quite who to vote for, and of course, there's so much dispute about what the priorities are, what the priorities are going forward for the church, and so forth. There's such a mix of opinion that I think it's very difficult to gather around a particular body of opinion to find consensus. And I think it's true, yeah.
Well, we've seen a number of private meetings. I mean, I've seen them myself by various groups of cardinals. Why is it so hard for them to land on a candidate or two? They've done this before, at least the older ones have. And are there promoters of particular cardinals that you've come across?
Well, I think it's really partly to do with the diversity of the college now. I mean, there's so many cardinals from diverse parts of the world. There's more cardinals than ever at this conclave. You've got, I think it was 48 different countries. No, was it a country? Anyway, it's gone up to 70 now. So it's a large increase. And so yeah, there's that challenge to contend with, and there's other things too. It's just a very disparate group, and so many, as I've just said, so many different opinions as well.
Mm-hmm. Cardinal Dominic Memberte, who celebrated the final Mass of mourning that I attended on Sunday at St. Peter's for Pope Francis, he's being chattered about by cardinals as a possible compromise candidate. He is head of the Signatura here in Rome, the High Court, the Supreme Court of the Vatican. Tell us a little about him and why his name is emerging now, do you think?
Yes, well, he's been very much a figure of the Curia for the last 20 years, really, because he was actually Secretary for Relations with States. He was like the Vatican foreign minister. Mm-hmm. I remember when he was in that position, he was well regarded. He was not considered, though, sort of your classic diplomat. He is somebody who does take doctrine seriously. He wasn't a pragmatist who was willing to cast that aside. So he's considered to be more sort of on the conservative wing, if you like, if you want to use that label. But so that's what sort of puts him in that mold. And he's a quiet man. He's actually quite timid. And I think that makes him seem as though he could be somebody to be that sort of calm, safe pair of hands that many feel is needed after the disruption of the Francis pontificate.
Yes, I keep hearing this from cardinals all over the world. We want a quiet pontificate. We've had enough noise. We've had enough chaos. We just want quiet. You know, it's like a father with children. They don't want them to be good or bad, just quiet. What about Cardinal Michael Czerny's comments about African popes that are now emerging? Tell us about that.
Yes, well, he's saying he's been coming out quite strongly in an article in the New York Times saying that he thinks it's very dangerous. He said I can't remember the exact words, but something like they're very dangerous about the cardinals, the African cardinals that he knows, and he thinks it would be very problematic if any of them become pope. He was quite forthright about it, and I think it's probably because the African Church, the cardinals, are very strong on moral issues. They uphold the Church's teaching on apostolic tradition and the traditional doctrine, and so I think that riles up, I think, those who are pushing constantly for a progressive view of the Church.
Yeah, Czerny, we should say, is a Jesuit, very close collaborator with Pope Francis, and has already echoed that he thinks the Francis vision should continue. Who else do you see as papabile, possible pope at this point? Your top four candidates, if you had to run them down, and I'm asking you to run them down.
Okay, I think just to give sort of an overview, because I don't think, who knows if they're going to actually be elected or whatever, but right. I think Cardinal Peter Erdo is considered one of the leading candidates because he's a canon lawyer. He's somebody who can put order back into the Church because of the rather lawless few years we've had under Francis. And that could be done, that could be quite easily done, apparently, canonically changed and brought back to the Church back onto an even keel. So he's one of the leading candidates. Then there's Cardinal Pietro Parolin, of course, the former Vatican Secretary of State, who is well known, and he's done a lot in terms of Vatican diplomacy. But there's problems with him regarding the Vatican-China deal, of course, which is controversial and still causing waves. And
you don't think the financial, excuse me for a moment, you don't believe his involvement in that financial scandal and the China deal sort of end his candidacy?
Well, it could do, but I mean, the financial deal is often associated with the London deal. I mean, that was, I think, signed really before he became Secretary of State. That was under Cardinal Bertoni's leadership in the Curia, and I think that was really, yes, predated him.
Okay,
but he did have some involvement in trying to resolve it.
Yes.
So, and that wasn't necessarily satisfactory. So there is that, but and then the other financial problems were kind of to do with APSA, which is the Office for the Real Estate and Patrimony of the Holy See, and that was also out of his purview. So I think he did what he could in that, and I think that's less of a problem. But certainly the China deal and his attitude to diplomacy and his rather pragmatic view, I think that can be seen as something problematic going forward. Yeah.
Give us a sense of any other candidates. So Parolin, Erdo, who else?
Yes. Well, then you've got Cardinal Willem Eijk of the Netherlands. He's often not thought of because he's a very quiet, another quiet cardinal who doesn't make waves, but is seen as very solid, somebody who can really right the ship and be calm and bring back a certain order back to the pontificate. Mm-hmm. And then I suppose you've got another cardinal who's often not mentioned, but is on paper at least, has a lot to offer, and that's Cardinal Malcolm Ranjit of Colombo, Sri Lanka, because he's got all of the experience that you would want in a pope. He's got the pastoral. He was a parish priest. He's now Archbishop of Colombo, so and he's had to deal with real challenges there. And he's been a diplomat, though he's not a trained diplomat, but he was sent to East Timor by Pope Benedict to serve there as nuncio. And he's got service in the Curia too. He did a lot of work as secretary at the Dicastery for Divine Worship. So he's got a good all-round vision, and he speaks something like 10 languages.
Do you think the Asian bishops would be welcoming to him or in support?
I think they could be, yeah. And the thing about the Asian cardinals is that they're much bigger now. They're a much bigger group. I think there were only 10 at the last one, and now 20 or 25 or something. I think they've doubled in number or so. So they have a large presence now.
Before I let you go, and I want everybody to go read your column, you wrote a recent column where you run down the 10 critical issues facing the next pope. And I'll just run through a few of them. Return to the papacy as the source of sound doctrine and unity. Clarification of Vatican II and reform of the Jesuits. Why are those critical?
Well, because I think the period over the last 12 years has been very much a clarifying period, if you like, one in which what's been seen has been a great ambiguity in doctrine and great confusion and lack of clarity. So there's been clarity and then there's been lack of clarity. And so that's one of the fruits of Francis' pontificate, is that it inadvertently, in many ways, shed a light on just how problematic and murky church doctrine has become, especially on morals issues, but also on the liturgy and so forth since the council. And I think it sort of came to a head under Francis. So I think it's also something that Cardinal Pell was very keen on too, was this return to apostolic tradition, to clarity of doctrine, to canon law and respecting canon law. And so I think that seems to be that probably is a priority, or I think many people feel it should be a priority for the.
Ed Pentin, what should people be focused on as this conclave begins? What should they be watchful for? Any signs in the early, once a pope is announced, the name he takes, the dress he wears as he appears on that loggia, which we now know means a lot more than just preference.
Yeah, no, exactly, Raymond. It's going to be very interesting, and those are the things to look for, because there'll be signs of where he's going to take the pontificate. The papacy, and that'll be quite clear. Is he going to stay in the papal apartments? Is he going to stay in Santa Marta like Pope Francis, or is he going to sort of come back to the more traditional pope, to be a traditional pope like in the past? And there is a certain wish for that, I think, among many of the faithful. At least that's what I hear, is that they want the church to come back to a little more to tradition and be rooted in that. So we'll see. Yeah.
Ed Pentin, thank you for all of your good work. collegeofcardinalsreport.com, an indispensable source for who these men are, where they come from, and the breakdown by the issues is just incredible. Ed Pentin, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Raymond. Great to be with you.
The Arroyo Grande Conclave Crew Vatican edition will continue. Look, send those questions in. Go to Raymond@RaymondArroyo.com or just drop it in the comments here. We'll get to them tomorrow. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to the Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube or Arroyo Grande Podcast, wherever you get yours. And this series has been brought to you by our friends at Taylor Fergon Capital Management, Faith, Family, and Finances. They're at taylorfergon.com, as well as Floriani, revitalizing sacred music, floriani.org. On behalf of Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, and Ed Pentin this time, we will convene again. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Rome. See you next time. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and is available on the iHeart Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.